The walls of the Victorian Asylum were not built for healing. They were built for silence. Behind iron gates and high brick walls, women disappeared. Daughters, wives, mothers, all labeled with one word that erased their identities: mad. In Victorian Britain, madness was rarely a medical condition. It was a verdict. A husband's accusation, a father's complaint, or a neighbor's gossip could send a woman to the asylum for years, sometimes for life. Her crime might have been speaking too loudly, mourning too long, or daring to disagree. Society called it treatment. But what truly waited inside was punishment disguised as medicine. A woman's arrival began with her name stripped away and replaced by a patient number. The air smelled of carbonic acid and despair. A matron's voice echoed through corridors lined with iron doors and observation grates. A doctor's notes would later call her hysterical, defiant, or melancholic, catch-all words that excused whatever cruelty followed. The routine began before dawn. Cold water poured from metal buckets onto shivering bodies, to shock the nerves. Meals were boiled mush, served without speaking. Conversation was forbidden. Letters home were censored or destroyed. Some women spent entire days locked in restraint chairs, arms and legs bound, heads forced back, all to calm their excitable tendencies. Others were confined in isolation rooms padded not for safety, but to muffle their screams. Medication was another form of control. Laudanum, bromide, and opium, doses strong enough to dull the mind, were administered not as treatment, but obedience. Those who resisted were subjected to what physicians proudly called moral management, labor in laundry rooms, endless sewing, scrubbing floors. Each chore was a reminder that submission was health and defiance was illness. Doctors wrote about curing women through exhaustion, draining their spirits until silence replaced rebellion. The asylum was designed not to heal but to erase difference, to reshape the female mind into something compliant. But the women inside were not always silent. Some scratched messages into the walls. Others smuggled out letters, fragments of truth that survived when everything else was buried. One letter, found years later in a casebook from Bethlehem Hospital, read simply, "They tell me I am unwell because I weep for my children. I would rather they called that love than madness." That line, anonymous and trembling, captures what many endured: grief treated as insanity, motherhood weaponized as evidence of weakness. The asylum system turned natural emotion into a symptom. A widow who mourned too long could be labeled melancholic. A wife who refused her husband could be declared hysterical. A woman who read too much or asked too many questions might be deemed intellectually unstable. The power to declare insanity lay entirely with men: doctors, magistrates, relatives. Women had no right to appeal. Once inside, their world shrank to a bed, a corridor, a locked door. The sound of keys turning became a kind of clock, marking time not in hours but in years lost. The records describe treatments that today sound more like torment. Ice baths for overexcitement, electric shocks to the temples to correct delusions, spinning chairs that induced vomiting and unconsciousness, believed to reset the mind. And in the darkest corners, surgical interventions, clitoridectomies, forced sterilizations, procedures meant to cut away what doctors called the source of female hysteria. But even within that cruelty, some women fought back. A few learned to write petitions, carefully addressed to the commissioners of lunacy, the government body that oversaw asylums. Some were freed after years, their sanity restored not by medicine but by persistence. Others never left, their names forgotten, their faces fading into hospital sketches labeled chronic. Yet the stories they left behind, in diaries, in hidden letters, in marginal notes, reveal something powerful. They weren't mad. They were women who refused to fit the mold. And in a world ruled by propriety and patriarchy, that was the greatest threat of all. The asylum became a mirror of society's fear of women who felt too deeply, spoke too freely, or lived too independently. Doctors claimed to study mental illness, but what they truly studied was obedience. Each diagnosis was a sentence, each treatment a warning to those outside the walls. Some families visited once, maybe twice, then never again. A patient's name might still appear on family records, but she was spoken of only in whispers, sent away for her nerves, gone to convalesce. Few ever questioned what that meant. Inside, those same women were beaten for crying, starved for protesting, restrained for remembering who they were. One nurse's memoir from 1882 described a ward of 20 women, all silent except one, an elderly lady who hummed softly to herself. When asked why she sang, she said, "It's the only way to know I'm still alive." That line, buried in an archive for more than a century, is a testament to how even in silence, resistance survived. By the late 19th century, reformers began to question these practices. Journalists exposed overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and the inhumane treatments. But real change came slowly. For many women, decades passed in cells designed to erase them from the world. What makes this history even darker is how ordinary it became, how society accepted the asylum not as cruelty, but as necessity. By the turn of the 20th century, the walls of those asylums had witnessed generations of women broken, and a few who somehow refused to bend. Their names rarely appeared in official records, but their stories bled through the margins of history, fragments left behind in forgotten ledgers, journals, and letters smuggled out through sympathetic attendants. One such record tells of a woman named Mary H., committed by her husband for irrational outbursts. Her offense? Publicly opposing his business partner in a local dispute. She spent 12 years in confinement. Her medical file described her as incurably agitated, though witnesses recalled her only as intelligent and outspoken. In one of her final notes, written on the back of a medicine label, she scrawled, "They call me unquiet. But if I am quiet, I no longer exist." That single sentence exposes the truth of the Victorian asylum. Silence was not healing, it was erasure. For every Mary, there were thousands. Women confined for postnatal depression, for expressing grief, for refusing arranged marriages, for simply being difficult. The word mad became a weapon sharper than any blade. It turned wives into prisoners, thinkers into patients, and sorrow into sin. Inside these walls, medical authority blended with moral judgment. Doctors documented female insanity as a disease of excess emotion, a failure to maintain composure, modesty, or submission. Treatments reflected that ideology: shock, restraint, starvation, ice, and sedation. But none of these methods sought recovery. They sought correction. The goal was to make women behave. Those who didn't were marked as hopeless cases. Many died young from infection, malnutrition, or despair. Some were buried in unmarked graves within asylum grounds, their identities reduced to numbers carved into small stones. Visitors walking those graveyards today might see rows of identical markers, each representing a life taken not by illness, but by institutional cruelty. Outside, the same society that condemned them continued to celebrate progress, railways, industry, science, while its daughters languished in iron beds, punished for feeling. And yet, even from within the system, seeds of defiance began to grow. A few nurses, appalled by what they saw, documented the abuses. Some early psychiatrists, women themselves, rare and ridiculed, began to challenge the idea that female emotion equaled insanity. Writers and journalists exposed the truth in serialized reports, describing filth, overcrowding, and the screams that echoed through night wards. One of the most famous exposures came in 1887, when journalist Nellie Bly went undercover in a New York asylum. Though not British, her account reflected the same cruelty across the Atlantic: force-feeding, beatings, icy baths. Her words ignited public outrage and reform. In Britain, similar whispers began to circulate. A few asylums were investigated, conditions slightly improved. But for thousands of women already condemned, the change came too late. The legacy of the Victorian asylum did not end with its closure. It left behind something more insidious, a belief that a woman's emotions could be evidence against her. That legacy seeped into medicine, literature, even law. Hysteria remained a diagnosis well into the 20th century, echoing those same patriarchal fears dressed up as science. Today, when we read the letters, the records, the testimonies, we hear the same refrain: women punished for speaking, for grieving, for refusing to conform. The asylum was a mirror that reflected the values of its time, and those reflections are uncomfortably familiar. Because the question it asks is not just historical. It's human. How often has society silenced those it calls unstable when all they were was unheard? Each of those locked doors, each of those forgotten graves, tells a story that never truly ended. Their suffering built the foundation of modern psychiatry, but also its cautionary shadow. To remember them is not just to revisit cruelty. It's to recognize the cost of mistaking obedience for sanity. And so, when we walk past the ruins of these asylums, overgrown courtyards, rusted gates, fading plaques, we are walking through the remnants of thousands of stolen voices. The echo of their silence still lingers in every discussion about control, conformity, and who gets to define normal, because the truth is simple and haunting. They weren't mad. They were made to appear that way. Their stories remind us that history's cruelest prisons weren't built from stone or steel. They were built from fear and from the power to call a woman insane for refusing to be silent. So remember them. Speak their names if you find them in old records. Read their letters if you can. And never forget that silence, once their sentence, is now our responsibility to break. If this story moved you, make sure you subscribe and share, because history only stays buried if we let it.